Okay, hi everyone. Welcome to our launch this evening, and thank you for joining us. We are, of course, here to launch David Wheatley's new collection, Child Ballad, which you can buy with your discount code. So thanks for paying to be in this launch with us. I've put the discount code in the chat for you, and we really appreciate your support. So please do go and buy copies for yourself and everyone you know. David is here. He's going to read for us this evening, and just so you know what's going to happen, I'm just going to run over, the setting of tonight. So while David is reading, I'm going to have the text up on screen for you to follow along with, just as a bit of a visual guide. You are, as ever, in control of your own screen, so if you need to reconfigure it, just have a play around, and you should be able to change it to suit your needs if you do. As ever, if you've got any technical problems, pop them in the chat and I'll try my best to help you while we go through the event. Now, I can see that some of you have found the chat. It's cool to see where you're watching from. That's really nice. Make sure that when you use the chat, you select everyone on the drop down so that we can all see each other's messages and they don't get lost. As well as finding the chat, please can you find another button? I'm sure you're all used to this by now, but for anyone this is their first Carcanet event, we also use the Q&A button. So that's for later on in the event. If you've got any questions for David about the new book or about his work in general, you can pop those questions into the Q&A box and David will be able to answer them later on in the event. Now, that will be when he is chatting with Patrick McGuinness, who I'm really pleased is joining us this evening. He's going to be able to put those questions to David later on in the event, and I'm very pleased that he's joining us now. I'm going to hand over to him in a second. So you are aware of who he is. Patrick McGuinness is the author of 2 novels, a memoir, and 2 books of poems. Both of those books of poems have come out with us at Carcanet Press. They were The Canals of Mars, which came out in 2004, and Jilted City, which came out in 2010. And I'll just pop a link in the chat for you there. You should go to his author page and you can check out those 2 books and the other books that he's worked on for us at Carcanet Press. Sorry, I couldn't get those words out. So without further ado, I'm going to ask Patrick to join me on screen so that we can get going properly. Thanks, Patrick.
Hello, thank you, Jasmine. Welcome everyone to David's launch, and I'm very grateful to David and Jasmine and to Carcanet for asking me to introduce David, because David's a poet I've known for a long time, both as a person and as a writer of not just poetry of extraordinary range and curiosity, but also as a really penetrating and open-minded critic and someone who contributes to the poetry culture in all sorts of ways. And we're very lucky to have him, and we're especially lucky to have him this evening reading from his new book. On the off chance that you don't already know who he is, I'm going to give you a very compact introduction to what he's done over the years. He's currently Professor of English at the University of Aberdeen. Child Ballad, which I have here in the flesh, is his 2nd Carcanet collection, but it's in fact his 6th collection of poetry. And I mentioned earlier that he was a notable critic and somebody who contributes a huge amount to our reading and critical culture. And just some of his critical essays about poetry have appeared in places such as the Oxford Handbook of Modern Irish Poetry, Handbook of Victorian Poetry, Contemporary British and Irish Poetry, British and Irish War Poetry, Companion to Seamus Heaney, and the Cambridge Companion to Contemporary Irish Poetry. One of the things that I also most enjoyed of his recently was his quite extraordinary novel, Stretto, which came out last year from Charles Boyle CB editions, a rather uncategorizable work, which seemed to me to be not of a piece with his poetry as such, but interestingly connected to it. And I'm going to ask him about that later. But for now, I'm going to introduce him and invite him to read his poems, which is why we're here. David, step onto the virtual stage, please.
Okay, many thanks for those introductions from Jasmine and from Patrick there. And I will proceed on the assumption that the technology is working. Let me know if it isn't. And to begin with, I'm going to read you the opening poem for the book from this very handsome volume, The Companions of Columkill. Now, the opening poem is set in the 6th or 7th, or is it the 17th century? It can't seem to make its mind up if it's talking about some Irish saints journeying in Scotland or the ransacking of Aberdeen by royalist forces in 1644. I noticed there's some confusion about languages too, which is quite topical given that my workplace, the University of Aberdeen, is currently in the news for its attempts to shut down its modern languages department. What would St. Columkill have to say about that? He'd be withering, I'm sure. Well, anyway, here goes with, I suppose, a point of entry into the Scottish dreamscape, the Companions of Columkill. If I never go home, it is because the tides, I have noticed, flow in one direction only. With Viking anger, the North Sea snapped at my heels on the foreshore as I marvelled at its circling, patterned collapse, the golden spiral in my Euclid turning before my eyes. When the Covenanter, who led me, arrived at the city gates, he would not pay the king's penny to cross the bridge, but stood transfixed by those swithering waters. The road was closed, he told me. We would have to go back. I saw the long-beaked oyster catchers gazing down from their nests along the flat roofs, and knew this for the place where Devenick, Turnan, and Drosten had passed before me, drawn ever further north and east. I swore an oath at the market cross to a man who answered to the Earl of Montrose, and a prayer book was placed in my hand. Much later, when the peace was won, bodies decently buried were exhumed and despoiled, marking an end to it all. I attempted to read the Psalms in the vernacular, but did not know what language that was. If you throw out a hand in the dark of the chapel, a door to the bell tower will be there, and a view from above that promised once, not now, to make everything clear. Well, moving on, my children feature quite a bit in this book, I must confess. And the next poem, which is called One Door May Conceal Another, is about my son's experience of self-discovery in the glass panel of a sliding door when he was slightly younger than he is now. If all else fails, though, my plan B for this evening is just to go and get him, and he could do some demonstrations of these things himself. But I'm sure he'd be only too happy to help. And the epigraph to this poem comes from Francis Ponge, whose work will be intimately known to Patrick. Kings don't touch doors. Les rats ne touchent pas aux portes. What a pleasure they're missing out on it, always having somebody opening the door for them. One word maybe that does need explanation here is press. A press is a cupboard. That's a Hiberno English hill to die on for me. But here it goes. One door may conceal another. Les rats ne touchent pas aux portes. It is the month of May. You open and you close. You open and close the door, the press, a small plastic replica of the house. You bring to the unappeasable destruction of small towers the ambling gait of a watchful gunslinger, tumbled smack to the floor. For that he starteth and leapeth and boundeth with jubilation, thinks the tabby cat, hunched, alarmed face at your feet. You slide the glass door open, and surprised but pleased, see your face swim into place on another behind it. Walls are doors, shifting tectonic plates of the open and closed, the way in and out. Imagine the sadness of kings never touching doors for themselves, or uncovering with small anemone fingers trailed round the edge of the door their faces. Face waiting all that time to emerge from behind your mother's and mine. There is the you behind the door and the you that comes through it. In search of a book full of moving parts. You open the door and, shrieking splay-fingered, brace your open arms with the thrill of this, just this here. Now, the title poem, or one of two title poems in the book, Child Ballad, is about my daughter, Morven, and there are an awful lot of ballads from the Scottish Northeast. Um, so it has a kind of local flavour and savour to it. Morven herself has a namesake, which is a mountain just about visible from the village I live in. And for a long time, the human Morven refused to acknowledge the existence of the mountain Morven. She seemed to feel it to be some kind of encroachment or on her identity. I'm pleased to report that they have recently come to an understanding. So in honor of this integration of Morven, human Morvens into the landscape, here is a child ballad in her honor. I, Morven Afric Sive, a child of winter, doomed to follow where my parents wander, came unstuck, swapping the womb's dark amber for the paltry welcomes of November. Mother, father, brother offered comfort after all the way that I'd come for it. Out of the granite city I was carried to where that shining silver stone is quarried, and past the silent playground where I'll test the reach and grip of infant foot and fist. My first assertive cries dispersed across the damp fields mobbed by surly flights of crows. Dear family, I see that we're alike, if not the same. Whatever I might lack, I claim as mine, with busy grasping hands, untrained for now in telling foes from friends, but glad to find a yielding breast in reach. For all your pressing kindnesses, I pledge a stored up gratitude ye may decode from teenage eyebrows raised and blank eyes rolled. Whose life grows, whose wilts and falls away? What waiting futures do my two palms weigh? What songs you sing me round our daily haunts will I still know and sing long decades hence? I see our houses ballasted with junk, where books accumulate and bookshelves sink. What trace, tell me, should I hope to add to all that you have thought and dreamt and said? I am citizen, not subject, free-born daughter of the future I will earn, yet conscious of the highwaymen that stand in wait, a loaded pistol in each hand, and ready to relieve me from the start of all a girl might need to travel far. Faces swim from the half-light into view, our world enough for now, my all, my few. 9 months I sailed within my mother, now head up, now down, a fitful questing prow, in search of wider seas. Now you are the tide I plough, wide world, grant my sails Godspeed. Well, I mentioned modern languages, so I thought that I might give an outing to a French translation in the book, though I am aware of the audacity of reading a French translation in Patrick's presence, but nevertheless, in the 16th century, all Scots were also French subjects, thanks to Mary Queen of Scots, which was terribly handy for the Erasmus students back then. Now, this translation is from the poet Louis Aragon, and it's simply called "You Found Me Like a Pebble." And we have had Patrick McGuinness up to Aberdeen to talk about translation and poetry. But as I look at my text here, I have no memory whatever of the original, and I have no comments to offer whatever on whether I have deformed or honored the French text behind it. So with that blissful blindness, which enabled me to write this translation, here goes. You found me like a pebble. You found me like a pebble picked up on the shore, like a strange lost object whose use no one knows for sure. Like seaweed on a sextant deposited by the tide, like fog at a window asking only to come inside, like a midden of a hotel room no one has cleaned, the morning after a hoolie when the streets and gutters stream, a train traveller bumming a ride sat on the running board, a stream in the field sly river folk have managed to divert, a woodland creature passing cars have frozen in their glare, like a night watchman coming to at the bright dawn hour, like a shady prison dream that morning can't diffuse, like the panic of a bird flapping in the house, like on a lover's finger the signs of a wedding band, the burnt out shell of a car in some no man's land, like a torn up letter scattered to the four winds, like now summer's flown the tan it's left on your hands, like the glum looks of the lost and the misplaced paths we weave, like the left luggage bags you're planning to retrieve, like when a door or a shutter in the breeze go whack, the furrows of heart and tree alike where lightnings struck, a roadside stone that stands in for the memories we lose, pain that doesn't fade away, not like some old bruise, like some boat's vain SOS floated over the waves, like, long afterwards, the flesh's memory of the blade, like a bolted horse slaking his thirst in a ditch, like a pillow fever crops of nightmares have bewitched, like an insult to the sky with a straw blindfold on, like fury at these being nothing, at there being nothing new under the sun. You fan me in the dark, like a word reduced to babble, like a vagabond bedded down to sleep in the stable, like a dog with someone else's name on the collar, a man from days of yore, full of spleen and choler. Well, okay, moving on. I've always loved the poetry of Andrew Marvell, and I wrote the next poem for the 400th anniversary of his birth. That was 2 years ago. Now, it's always been known that Andrew Marvell, who was the MP for Kingston upon Hull, spent a period in Holland working as a spy. But recent research has suggested that he was working not for the English government, but in fact for the Dutch. He was a double agent, in other words. He may even have been in league with William of Orange, attempted to engineer William of Orange's ascension to the throne. A slippery character then, but one, I thought, whose intrigues speak eloquently to our current political situation. Mr. George was his code name while traveling on the continent. And the title is Portrait of a Man Thought to be Andrew Marvell. That's a portrait in the Ferrens Gallery in Hull, but I believe it's no longer thought to be the man himself. Here we go then. As one put drunk into a Humber keel, taking his chance on high tides, surge and swell, though soaked through, I feel my palms grow clammy at the thought of Winstead sliding from me. My mind is sand, the channels that it tills, the mazy, secret kingdoms that it builds. Albion's high towers in shadow now, infesting prelates their dark plumage show, until a man might keep a blade concealed about himself for who knows what dark need. Such a man as Mr. George, who crossed with me to Holland on some special tryst and pressed on me a pamphlet much inclined to warnings on fair liberty's decline. Nameless men I meet in coffee houses keep their wide brims pulled down on their faces, riddling where the root of power might lie, in pope or potentate, or must it die, if not for their great secret work in hand? The lords at home will learn of what they plan. Take signs for wonders. Apocalypse engulfed the great gunpowder keg one day in Delft. I saw Finch land stunned on a wall bracket. The fabric of reality had cracked, and I gone through it. My alias grown vague, I meet a king in waiting in The Hague, whose name it is not politic to share, in whom are wed divine right and forced power. The man once thought to be Marvell purses his lips at all these tragedies and farces, and Mr. George picks up a little Dutch for use at cards, the fish house, or at church, and opening new channels of accord to pass on what the lords at home report. But whose will be the kingdom still in shade, the guests for whom the still life feast is laid? The battle scenes show how the navy warred, the faces on the frigates faint and blurred, but a girl with the lute or posed with the terrier unseals the space of an interior. Strange privacies reclaimed like a polder from an outgrown frame that cannot hold her, and I, unmoored, whether I leave or stay, feel the ground shift and England slip away. Well, I think we're making good progress now, and the next poem I have for you is called The Fourth Craw. Now, nobody who has attended a Scottish book bug session at a library will fail to recognise that reference to the three craws of nursery rhyme fame. Three craws sat upon a wall, sat upon a wall, sat upon a wall. Three cross sat upon a wall. Well, this poem takes off from that rhyme and is written in memory of Roy Fisher, whose work has been a big influence on me. And in his early days, Roy Fisher was published by Stuart Montgomery's Fulcrum Press, and I sense there's quite a Fulcrum Press vibe to this book. There's another poem in it in honor of Tom Pickard, and there are many poetic conversations with 60s Fulcrum Press poet Loreen Neudecker too. Now, the Scottish connection here is that on his kind of stag weekend in 1746 or 1745, rather, Bonnie Prince Charlie got down as far as Derby before thinking the better of things and turning back. Derby being quite close to Roy Fisher's backyard. So, well, here goes anyway, the fourth craw in memory of Roy Fisher. I am driving the Jacobite army north from Derby. 3 craws sat upon a wall. You can go there if you want, into that past, all banners and ballads, and lie in its grievance, shaped to a vacancy. I remember the trampling of the flag, and a horse, legs gone, catching its tail as it fell. The first craw was greeting for his ma, assigning legs and arms to this or that body among the tangle, balletic tableau. I watched the sunlight cross the valley, merciless, but gilding our profiles fondly as we took flight. The second craw fell and broke his jaw. Living that high up, said the woman in the courtyard, holding my reins and gesturing over the hills. Anywhere else must feel like a come down. So many worlds of patient neglect, stored up for our return, and whose forgiveness won't come cheap. The third craw couldna flee awa, following by night the ginnels and shambles of leads, as though a blind man should trace with his fingers the features of a child's face. We came to the north, good enough to have stayed where we left it. And the fourth craw wasna there at all. The ways closed over behind us, and all manner of joyous lament finding its proper dark at last. Well, what does that leave? One more poem, simply called Marriage, and self-explanatory, I hope, set along the River Don, just over there from where I'm looking at the window. Marriage. In a house not ours, with no back door, I stared from an upstairs window, while you, among wind-tossed rags of peewits, tripped over furrows down to the river, and the nameless islands lapped by serene, unnavigable tides. I, too, tripping over bare floorboards, raised and missing, framed our son in the window of the preserved, abandoned child's room I'd found, as he stood and gazed the length of the river to where there could only be sea. All of us looking towards the mountain, we planted our steps with care in search of the one shared lucky foothold, somewhere between the shell of a life abandoned and the whole implacable summer to come. And I hope that is on schedule, and that's enough poems from me for now. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, David. That was terrific. As the audience will have gleaned, this is a book with lots of different moving parts to it. And I suppose I wanted to spend the 10 or 15 minutes we've got to talk together to ask a couple of questions before the audience comes in with their own. But I suppose I was quite struck in this book about how you seem to have responded so wholly, that is to say, culturally, intellectually, but also emotionally and physically and observationally to the landscape and the place and the languages that you live among in what is called rural Aberdeenshire, as it says in your book bio. This felt like a a book in which something that you talk about in one of your articles in relation to your work, you talk about the Irish subsoil, which your experience of living in Scotland has somehow returned you to. And I guess the thing that strikes me about your work all the time, but most especially in this book, is that it seems to be, on the one hand, incredibly rooted in place, culture, language, sounds. Scottish Gaelic is, has a large presence in your writing and way of seeing now. And it's also extraordinarily international work. Obviously, you're very inflected by French and France and French language literature. But I suppose my first question is really whether this book reflects not just a new kind of stage in your life, as the child ballad title suggests, but a new kind of way of thinking about place and history and your own modest place in place and history.
Well, at the risk of sounding like an aggrieved Facebook post about the future of languages in Aberdeen, it has struck me in recent times that when one thinks about the linguistic map of Northern Scotland, I count 6 languages that seem to form the jigsaw pieces. Some people do speak English, that this is undeniable, but beyond that, the northeast of Scotland is obviously a heartland for the speakers of Doric, as northeastern Scots is called. Gaelic is perhaps an obscure presence in these parts, but can be found by those who know how to go and root it out. Poets such as Sílas na Ceapaigh and Ian Lom pass through these regions. I mentioned Mary Queen of Scots for the French connection. I count at least 3 castles or Airbnb places where she spent weekends in the 1560s. But I suppose that the great Aberdeenshire poet of the Renaissance would be a man called Arthur Johnston, who wrote very elegant Latin poetry. There was a whole school of 16th century Latin poets who produced anthologies, the Musa Latina Aberdeenensis, and I think that they are all the more alluring for being almost entirely forgotten these days. And that leaves one more language. Norn would be the other, which was still spoken until the 18th century across the water in Orkney and Shetland, and produced such marvelous poets as Saint Ronald or Roggenwald or Callie Colson, as he's known in the Old Norn. So those are the jigsaw pieces, and they make very pretty patterns when assembled in crazy and chaotic ways by an incomer like me.
And do you actually feel like an incomer?
Well, it's a useful identity to cultivate, I suppose. So yes, I don't know what it would take to be accepted. I mean, if the weather is less than ideal on any given day, I suppose it's just good manners to refer to it as being Afadreek in the co-op. But I don't know if I went, for a fully immersive Scots conversation, would this be taken a good part or not? I test the waters,
So does your kind of full involvement, or at least throwing yourself into the place and the history of where you are, is that a way of re-engaging or keeping your own identity as an Irish writer sort of in play, as it were?
Well, one door can conceal another. One reality may lurk behind another, I suppose. If put on the spot, if you had a kind of Facebook quiz about contemporary events in Ireland, I would probably score embarrassingly low. I am aware of who the Taoiseach is. I probably couldn't name more than 2 or 3 other prominent contemporary Irish politicians. So at the risk of embarrassing myself by artificially maintaining connections, I simply engineer new ones instead, of dubious provenance perhaps, but maybe coiling around the previously internalized roots.
Good. No, I think that's probably the way to do it. You read one of your poems about to Roy Fisher, and what struck me about this book is the number of poems that are written for people, to people, and that strikes me as another way of creating a sense of community. You're very you see these poems as ways of communicating to other poets. I wondered if that was a driving idea in the way you write, that you're not just writing out into the public, but you see yourself as part of a constant dialogue between poets.
Well, a poet who I love, W.S. Graham, is a frequent dedicator, but I think he also takes one step beyond that again. There are many poems of his, later poems, in which the poem becomes a description of its own occasion. It
Mm.
might say in so many words, "Oh, look, I've just woken up with a terrible hangover and I can't find the bottle." And I think of you, my friend, at the other side of the village, and I think about what I might say in awkward, shuffling words to address you, and then just the kind of getting the engine started, thinking of the mode of address, the distant addressee, that becomes, it takes over and is the poem.
Mm.
And in fact, I've tried that on. I think in my last book there was a poem addressed to him.
Mm.
So that quality of address, but I think I would have to confess, I mean, here and now, that it is born out of a certain remoteness. You know, the Frank O'Hara thing about, well, why should I write a poem for you if I could just ring you up with the phone or go out and have a Coke with you instead? If you live at a certain physical distance from things, these qualities come more into focus as imaginative challenges in the absence of the actual physical community.
Yeah,
Not being around fellow poets very much as I am, apart from in my workplace.
yeah, yeah. You say somewhere that your local woods are a prime place for inspiration, but also education, and for sort of living life both in the moment and while stocking things up to write and think about. And you mentioned your very last poem, in which there's an enormous number of mushrooms occurring. And it made me think as well of your regular Twitter updates, where I've started to recognize the trees now that you take photos of. Maybe you could say a little bit about the relationship you have to the landscape and to the fauna and the flora, especially, and actually to mushrooms, which you seem to know a great deal
Mushrooms.
about.
Well, I was just inspecting some mushrooms in the wood this very afternoon. It seems, I'm guessing the seasons where I am are very different from where you are, but prime mushroom season, I would say, would be September, October, rather than this time of year. But there's some very good polypores to be found in the local wood, which, as it happens, is called paradise.
Mm.
It's some kind of reference to an enclosed garden. It became a biblical paradise in the mind of the 18th century laird. Bits of it keep getting chopped down. It's at the kind of precarious quality of a wood that is not a heritage wood and is a working wood, and therefore may disappear perhaps in unpredictable ways. But I know very much that the question of localism, of what you might call ultra localism. I mean, to go back to the question of being accepted as a local, if somebody in the village, for some reason, needed to know where they could find some um, amethyst deceivers, I suppose I could step in and say, this way, meet me on the 1st of October and we'll walk down to a Quithy Wood over here and there will be some amethyst deceivers right here. And that is a very ultra specific and all the more pleasing for that as a form of knowledge, imaginative parody, the territory you build up and carry around with you in the head. Yes. I was inspired, I think, as well in that long last poem by the great Duncan Bawn McIntyre, who I think is kind of, very fashionable these days. He's the, 18th century bard of the day these days, who carried around with him an encyclopedic knowledge of the flora and fauna of where he was. He also would know exactly where to find a purple amethyst deceiver, I think.
Yeah, yeah. So, one of the poems that you didn't read today, which I like very much, and I read it when it came out, I think it was in the TLS or the London Review of Books, is Immigrant Song, which struck me as being, wonderfully, wonderfully uneasy reading, as well as kind of affirmative reading. And I wondered if you could tell me more about that specific poem and what pushed you to writing it, and what it is about that idea of edges and immigration and migration and movement that keeps you coming back to it, even as you have clearly become so rooted that you can name all the mushrooms on your daily walk through the wood called paradise.
Well, I think the first thing to address would be the fact that the poem is a pantoum, which always reminds me of those slinky toys that walk down the stairs that have this diabolic energy. Just they keep going, but they're rather difficult to write. You know, the second and fourth becoming the fourth, first and third line of the following stanza, they slot together, but in very challenging ways. And as I would say ad nauseum to students about forms like sestinas with repeated elements, if the poem is doing any kind of good job, the elements will somehow morph and mutate as they're carried along, depending on like how the repeated line might slot into the beginning or the end of a sentence, and something has changed. And so similarly with the landscapes, remembered landscapes morphing and mutating into the ones in front of your eyes. Um, I can never write or read a pantoum without wanting to work in some kind of pun about a pantoum mime horse, if a horse could be trained to imitate a pantoum. But I'll just leave that one hanging.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, but it's not. It's quite subtly a pantoum, isn't it? Because actually, pantoums are often quite in your face and in your ear and in your eye, whereas this one, you don't necessarily feel its pantoominess until it's got going quite far. But those lines that I like very much, you know, sinking one country into another, and us not here yet, traveling towards it, strikes me as being quite central to, I don't know, the atmosphere, I suppose, the spiritual atmosphere of a lot of what you write. Not necessarily
Yeah.
just poetry either, actually.
The time lag effect. There's a French poem of Beckett's you may know called Arène de Lutèce. And well, he's sitting on the steps in the Arène de Lutèce, but then he sees himself coming in 10 minutes previously, and he watches himself march up to where he already is. And he offers no commentary on this peculiar time lag effect, but it opens peculiar new perspectives. And I think that um, the temptation to exist in multiple temporal timeframes is irresistible for me. The sense of simultaneity that things are going on in stereo, at least in stereo, in multiple frames of experience. It's like having lots of tabs open on your computer at any
Yeah,
one given moment.
yeah. Is there a particular form that you feel yourself drawn to? Because just, you know, this is a nice long book as well. You know, unlike a lot of certainly the poetry books that I write, which struggle to get beyond about 58 or 64 pages. You know, this one goes full on for about 136, 37 pages. And it's got extraordinary formal variety. And it does often have, you know, you're also very adept at that rather sort of pared down, stumpy Beckettian poem too. And then suddenly these pantoums and then these sequences and so on. Do you consciously try to keep the form varied, or do you think that everything you want to say has the form in which it should be said, and then it finds?
Um, just to rewind a little, I suppose I'd say the forms to which I'm drawn would be musical in some way. I would be aware of the different weights and valencies of now writing a sonnet, now writing something in those stumpy short lines, and I would rationalize this inconsistency by saying, well, it's just like Schubert sitting down and writing a mass, a string quartet, a symphony. Each calls for a different kind of musical gravity, and they achieve what they achieve on those terms. They find their own forms. Nothing would be nicer than writing a pantoum which a reader may read without knowing what a pantoum is, or without maybe noticing. I think Ashbery's exercises in that form are exemplary. The way that he can work the form and somehow under the reader's conscious radar. Um, what could be more tedious than the very effortful sestina, which we've all read at some point, which screams, "I am a sestina" on every line.
Yeah.
So if you could overcome that with some subtlety and then let the form work for you at the same time, that's what I'd aspire to.
Yeah. And do you feel then that the work, that the poem knows what it's going to be as it starts to piece itself together?
Well, I imagine that people who write thrillers fall into two distinct camps of those who do know who done it and those who write the book in order to find out. And well, thank you for praising me for writing a long book, but I suspect the reason why it's long is I experienced the writing process as like falling down the stairs. And at some point, you do reach the bottom with a bump, and then you think, well, I better pick myself up then and collect all my fragments. But no, I didn't begin that process of falling down the stairs with any kind of plan. But then it forms a form retrospectively, and then I tell myself, well, that must have been what I intended all along, wasn't it?
And you knew it was finished.
Yes.
You knew it was time to send that one in and then perhaps think about the next one, yeah?
I hope so.
Just
Yeah.
thinking about Tom Gunn, who only ever sent in a book of poems once he'd done the first third of the next one. So he didn't have that empty cupboard feeling that, I don't know about you, but I dread it. You know, I find the moment after sending in a book absolutely, you know, sort of neurotic vacancy for me. I don't feel any relief at all. I just feel emptiness. You?
Well, you could always go to a poetry conference in Belfast, Patrick, as we did last year, and
Yeah.
get some inspiration from that.
Yeah.
So I would recognize that syndrome, but thankfully I've been able to march on and pick up some new mushrooms and herbs and get started on the next one already.
Excellent. Well, that's very good. How do you feel that teaching at university helps or hinders the way you write? It's kind of an obvious question, but I'm asking it because I'm often asked it, and sometimes I say it helps me hugely, and other times I say it hinders me terribly. But you spend your days doing this great job, which is talking about literature to bright young people, which is what I also do. I'm not always sure it helps. How do you feel that relationship between teaching and making?
Well, I find the physical environment of the university very important. I strode I strode across the quad just the other day, full of thoughts about the aforementioned Latinists of the Renaissance and what they might think about the current fiasco with modern languages. And I often would find myself drifting into a kind of Scottish Renaissance dreamscape, which has maybe a tenuous connection to the business of going into a seminar room and talking about people's upcoming assessment. But there is some kind of point of connection there. And if I can bring my dreamscapes into that classroom, and then I can be invigorated in turn by what young people these days are thinking and writing, seems to work. Seems to work. I remember I had a very esteemed colleague at a previous institution. It was put to him that he should organize some kind of big academic conference on, you know, how we articulate our practice. And his version of this was, it seems to work. He wasn't in the habit of interrogating this too closely, maybe at the risk of making it go away. That would be my mantra too these days. It seems to work.
I suppose my last question is tangential to that, but related. You wrote a novel or something that finished up needing to be, for genre definition purposes, called a novel. That felt like something quite new and very original, and it seemed related to the kind of things you work on in poetry, but very different from it. Is that was that liberating, writing Stretto? Which is also a musical metaphor, isn't it?
It is. It's a car crash of metaphor, really, I think, because, well, if you listen to a Bach fugue and he introduces the subject and then a counter subject comes in slightly later, but if it comes in early and they slam into each other and they all start to pile up in this crazy way, you have Stretto. It's there, I think, in the C major fugue at the beginning of book one. And I find these musical comparisons very alluring. I spent all my life carrying them around in my head. I felt that they demanded some kind of expression. But sadly, you talk about the empty cupboard syndrome. I have another one building up in my head now, and I do happen to be on leave after Christmas. I fear there could be another outbreak of prose writing coming up quite soon.
Okay. I like the way you say prose writing rather than novel or fiction. In fact. Very good. Anyway, that's as well as saying how good and exciting and varied Child Ballad is, I do also commend David Stretto, which is an extraordinary piece of prose writing, which does all kinds of modern stroke postmodern things, but nonetheless has a kind of followable thread and a core. And it's enormous fun. David, do you have a last thing you would like to say before I open the doors to...
Only that I suppose that with, well, in retrospect, I should probably have selected the poem which has St. Lucy's Day in the title, because it is St. Lucy's Day, but it's too late for that. So I have no regrets. We just open up the questions.
Okay, good. So what I'm going to do is read a series of questions out. Everyone feel free to ask them. At the moment, the chat box is largely full of people saying hello, which is extremely good. And in fact, the different places from which people are saying hello is quite an interesting reflection of the internationalism and translingualism of David's own work. We've got Aberdeen, Speyside, Hiberno. Someone calling you Hiberno Weekly. That's Andrew McNeely.
It is. Hello, Andrew.
People from San Francisco, Amsterdam, Saskatoon, Northumberland, and on this occasion Oxford, from Luca. And yeah, it's like a kind of David Wheatley poem in a chat box. My first question is from Andrew McNeely, who you know, who has also published you. He says this: I know Tom Paulin's example is one you greatly admire. You honor him in the book. Do you feel yourself doing something like Pauline in a territory where you don't exactly belong or come from, and yet are in and of? Thank you, Andrew.
Well, that's a very good question. And just the other day, I was reading William Muir's novel, Imagine Corners, which is a wonderful novel of provincial life. There are some great Aberdeenshire novels which counterpose the farm and the city. William Muir's novel is somewhere in the middle, in a provincial town, pinched lives in provincial towns with neurotic ministers and people like, the Three Sisters, Chekhov sisters, who'll never get to Moscow. And it captures that world perfectly with great poignancy. And I think of Tom Paulin's work as doing something very similar in Irish poetry. His poem Anastasia McLaughlin, a very neglected world, I suppose, for Southern Irish poetry, of northern landscapes, Presbyterian landscapes, terrible respectability, terrible clenched, deforming gentility, with elements of Scots, Ulster Scots, or Scots around the edges too. It's a world I feel I know very well, and which it would be foolish to squander as an imaginative opportunity. And which in Paulin's case coexists with this very fiery Hazlitt style radicalism, and elements which coexist uneasily, spark off each other. I do think Paulin is a wonderful poet. Maybe even in particular his last two books. I say last because he hasn't been very active of late. Somebody once told me that his editor at Faber had to more or less go and burgle his house to get the last book off his hard drive into the Faber book. Well, somebody should give him a bit of a prod and see if he's still writing more of those wonderful poems these days. I hope he is.
Good, thank you very much. Another question you have is this: you have a poem in French in this collection, which I happen to know about because you ran it by me first. Do you often write in other languages?
Well, yes, I do. I mean, it is preposterous that I wrote a poem in French, but like I said, I mean, everybody born in Scotland in the 16th century was French because of accidents of politics, and I aspire to be a kind of walking linguistic accident myself. So why not? I mean, it had occurred to me that if I were to do a whole book of translations from Pierre Reverdy, I came up with an excellent title for it, Regreened, because that's what his work, his name literally means. So I feel my way into these linguistic opportunities, and then I find I just can't stop. Just get started, and it becomes addictive, even up to the point of writing in French. Maybe Latin will be next.
Okay. Well, so my question coming off of that one, which is, Is that your only poem in French then, or is it one of several and this is the one that you happen to put in?
There were some others in the past which have thankfully been consigned to oblivion.
Okay. How important, another question, how important is translation to your work?
Well, I did a large kind of book-length translation of French poet, the French Welsh poet Heather Dwallow, a while ago, and that was very congenial. I'm very pleased to see that there will be a new book of Irish language poets with my translations due quite soon. Very pleased because I think her work greatly outsells mine. So I'm happy to ride on those particular coattails.
Very good. Actually, talking of those coattails, Heather Dono or Dwyo, sorry, this is my question coming in because there's a pause in the questions here. When we last met in Aberdeen, it was for a conference partly on Heather Dono, who's this Welsh poet who wrote in French. And David sent me a series of his translations, and I've been also translating it with a potential view to perhaps publishing it. So if anyone here is interested, David and I are ready to go. Well, he's ready to go, I'm less ready to go. Maria Johnston in Dublin is actually asking, how about a song, David?
Well, I thought that was a song, effectively, the bug nursery rhyme. I think you're taking advantage of a refreshment as we talk. I don't have one to
I
hand.
am, yes.
It might be a necessary preliminary before we get to the song stage.
Okay, the post-reading cadence. Any more questions? I'm just checking the Q&A box again. I see no more questions here, in the chat at least. What I am going to do instead is just read a couple of nice things that people have said, which I think are also important. Alison Brackenbury, a very good evening from the biting north winds of Gloucestershire. I was very moved by David's poems, especially those alive with children. I also very much admired the varied beats of their lines. Very best seasonal wishes to you all. I feel like I'm hosting a sort of daytime television show, reading comments off the auto cue. There don't seem to be any more questions. We're now at 7:54. I'm holding out for another question. David, do you want to ask yourself a question?
Well,
what would be the question you ask yourself if you were attending this particular launch?
I'd probably ask myself if I noticed any mistakes yet.
Well, I checked your French one, and there are no mistakes.
Okay.
Yeah. Good.
I hear some vigorous gymnastic activity from an adjoining room with the much mentioned children doing their thing. So I suppose the great joy of having younger people is that you can just shamelessly turn their everyday activities into raw material, and that's what I tell myself. As I prepare to go and help them to get to bed, it's all material, really.
Yes. Well, that's very good. Well, we actually have had some requests now. So Beverly in San Francisco would like one last poem for a late arriver, and in fact, Lydia Harris has asked for the St. Lucy's Day poem by name. So
okay, well,
do that.
I'll just extract that. Yeah. A diurnal upon St. Lucy's Day, so inverting John Donne. This handful of earth we have selected. Enter its landscape, you are expected, and while you drift to sleep, my son, and dream of the circuit drive you're on, we leave the village by the bridge where the Afford Railway meets the hitch of track and bridge both running out, and weeping her small circling note, a curlew flies from flooded field to field in search of reeds and bield. O Benahee, Pitfickie and Caird William, Three wise tors that stand above the snaking river dawn, and whose stone circles kiss the sun on solstice mornings when worlds touch and snowdrifts dazzle patch on patch. Hem us in against the cold, poor sheep foregathered in the fold, who stare like them and see our gaze returned to us from their blank eyes. A quarry guards its sunken wound beyond the pinewood clearance meant for houses, but left raked and bare. Grant us, O Lord, our freehold here, and our small hypocrite descent, when later waves presume to plant their tarmac lawns of spacious drives, tailgaters come to live our lives and multiply the daily round from village lanes to far-flung town. Turning from home, we hug the wall of Cluny Castle's darkling pile and hear the congregated geese, their heckles picking at the breeze. We come, we go, a migrant tide, our lights are islanded in shade, the paths we take, pure instinct now, as the gritters and the snows allow. This permanence we grow into, the passing accident we pass through. Well.
That's an absolutely wonderful poem.
Okay, thank
I'm
you.
really glad you wrote that, and I'm glad you read it, and I've just enjoyed reading it as you spoke. Absolutely terrific. David, thank you very much, and thank you all for coming. And I commend the book, and I really enjoyed it. And thanks for asking me to
Thank you.
host.
Thank you to everybody. Thank you so much.
Thank you guys both so much. It's been really fun to hear you guys chatting about the book, and thanks for your reading, David. And thank you guys all for being here. I've put the link in the chat for you again, so please do go and buy a copy of the book and use your discount code. Well, you've got a couple of weeks to use that one. And I think that's everything, really.
Okay.
Our next launch isn't until the next year now, so you can join us again. We're launching Angela Layton's book towards the end of January, and I'm putting that in the chat for you as well. But that's everything. So yeah, congratulations, David.
Thank you.
And
Thank you so much.
both very much for a lovely evening.
Congratulations, David.
Thank you. No, thank you. Good night, all. Bye.
Bye.
Bye. Bye.